The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the third day of this 7-day sesshin here in September 2022 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to go through a very deep teaching by Torei Enji, who was the first successor of the great Zen master Hakuin. Hakuin, as you know, Hakuin Ekaku was his Buddhist name, basically reinvigorated, brought back to life the Rinzai sect in Japan. Religions go through periods of more abundance, and then they rise. Often one person has a deep enough insight to bring it back to life. And then over the centuries, that begins to fade again, and it sinks again, and then somebody else hopefully brings it back to life. In the case of the Japan of its time, it was Hakuin who did that. And Torei was, he was deeply yearning for understanding, for something beyond the veil, as sometimes it's put, even as a child. And many of us open to that yearning as young people. I remember 7, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, 11, 12, having that sense myself and trying to find it in all the ways that were available to me then, which were not Buddhist. Even to set up an altar under the stairway in our finished basement in Cleveland Heights, and poured through the Bible that my grandmother had given me for my 10th birthday, searching for some clues as to how that could be awakened. I had a sense that somehow in that book there were clues. It was too early to find them at that time, although now I can see that there are gems of deep, profound wisdom, particularly in the words of Jesus in the Bible. A lot of the rest of it happens to be just cultural history, but there are some awakened expressions. But Torei had the advantage of living in a country where Buddhism, which had essentially not lost that access to that profound teaching, especially through Hakuin, was still available. And when he was 8, I think it was, he became a monk. Of course, it was a novice monk at that point in time, but he, like Hakuin, was deeply moved to search. Hakuin himself at that age used to go up in the hillside behind his house in Japan. His family had an inn on the road between Edo, or nowadays called Tokyo, and the provinces. And every year, twice a year, in those days, the province leaders, the daimyo, were called to the presence of the head of the country. It was mandated, in part, presumably, so that it would impoverish them, so that they wouldn't have the money to uprise against the government. But whatever it was, his family, Hakuin's family, had a small inn for the mid-level of people that would accompany those processions, and not for the daimyos themselves, but for the higher folks in the procession. And Hakuin, as I said, would go up behind his house, and apparently there was a flat rock, and there was also apparently a rock that bore some semblance to Kuan Yin, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And he would chant the Kuan Yin Sutras and yearn to be liberated by them from what he was convinced was a definite road to hell for him. It's interesting that nowadays his temple is still operating in Japan. They have a small sangha. Last I knew, I visited there several times and sat in that incredibly powerful zendo. And they do chanting. They also have a drum group, taiko, the Japanese drumming group that practices there. And I looked at the chant books. By the way, everybody in the room where they do chanting sits on little benches, little personal benches. And each one of the chants had something to do with Kuan Yin. Hakuin himself had a deep, deep relationship with Kuan Yin. But I'm getting astray from what I wanted to originally talk about here. At any rate, Torei found his way to Hakuin's temple, Shoinji, when he was about 20. He'd already had a Kensho experience and practiced deeply. Hakuin had many, many monks around him by the time he grew old, so many that the temple was not able to hold all of them by any means. And they camped in gardens and in the woods and found some way to live when they couldn't actually be at the temple. When he inherited it, it was terribly run down. And in fact, he used to have to wear a raincoat inside because the roof leaked so badly. And of course, it does rain a great deal in Japan. Torei was seriously dedicated to practice. And at one point went on an extended solo retreat where he really didn't pay attention to sleep or food. And as a result, in damp Japan, he got sick. It's thought that it may have been tuberculosis. And of course, back then, there was no such thing as an antibiotic to deal with it. And he got so sick that he was dying, and the doctors gave up on him. They said either he would die pretty soon, or he would not live a very long life. And yet he did. He lived well into his 70s, I believe. But this was when he was 26, I think, that this happened, 26, 27. And he decided, since he was, in essence, given a death sentence that was fairly close. We all have death sentences, but most of us feel like they're sort of off in the far off, distant future. But for him, it was real. He was sick, and so he decided that he would simply rest. And when he had enough energy during the day, he would write down what he understood about Zen practice. And of course, by then he'd been practicing quite a long time, and very, very, very seriously and very concentratedly. And so he did. And for 6 months, that's what he did. He rested when he felt he needed to rest, slept when he felt he needed to sleep. Very Zen-like, by the way. And the rest of the time he wrote about Zen practice. That writing is available today through the Zen Center London, whose abbess had translated it. She's not alive anymore. Her Buddhist name was Myokyo Ni, Ni indicating a female priest. And it's a beautiful translation. Not only does it have Torei Enji's words in it, his teachings really, but it also has a translation of the commentary on it by a contemporary to Myokyoni, Buddhist priest. I can't remember what Rinzai temple he was from, but at any rate, he was in the 1900s, and it's an excellent, deeply inspiring read. It doesn't. You can't just run right through it, which you shouldn't anyway. You should read bits and pieces and absorb it deeply. And with the comments of Daibi, it is particularly helpful. There's another translation, a more modern translation, or I should say a more recent translation, they're both modern, that was done by one of the Cleary brothers, and it does not have Daibi's commentary, which is unfortunate, because Daibi's commentary offers a lot of explanations of terms and environment and cultural conditions of the time that Torei wrote this book. It's called The Undying Lamp of Zen, I think is what it's called with the Cleary translation. And in the Zen Center of London, I think it's the treatise on the Undying Lamp of Zen. At any rate, I highly recommend the book. It is a little bit of a challenge to try to access the Zen Center of London, but you can, and they will ship them. Many people have taken advantage of that. You can also get a used copy for an enormous amount of money through Amazon, something like $500, whereas it's something like $40 to get it through Zen Center of London. He wrote this all out, and then when he got well, right about the time he got well, Hakuin sent him a letter asking him to come and see him. And so when he went, he brought this treatise and offered it to Hakuin and said, do with it what you will. If you don't think it has any value, please destroy it. Otherwise, you're welcome to share it or whatever you want. And thankfully, Hakuin had the sense to get it published, and so we have access to it today. But Torei was a remarkable man. He remained deeply interested in practice his entire life. And Hakuin kept trying to rope him into teaching. But, for example, he was asked to go in and resurrect one of the Rinzai temples. And he did do it, but he only stayed a year, and then he left again to go on personal retreat. And he did write this vow of the Bodhisattva, which we chant every morning during sesshin, and sometimes otherwise as well. It was translated sort of both by a monk, a Spanish monk at Sogenji, Hosan Doho, and also Yuho, an American monk who still lives in Japan and worked as a translator for most of his adult life, and has translated some amazing works. He kind of polished it. So here it is. I will share it, although some of you may already know it by heart. And it's worth memorizing it, because it is a very, very deep teaching, and I'll expand a little bit on that in this talk. Disciples, when I humbly observe the true nature of things, all are the marvelous manifestation of the Tathagata's truth. Atom by atom, instant by instant, all are none other than this mysterious radiance. And modern science has verified this. I won't get into that right now because it's less important than the rest. All are none other than this mysterious radiance, Because of this, our virtuous ancestors extended loving care and reverence toward even such beings as birds and beasts. How then can we be but humbly grateful for the food, drink, and clothing that nourishes and protects us throughout the day, these being in essence the warm skin and flesh of the great masters and the incarnate compassion of the Buddha? If it is so even with inanimate objects, how much more should we be kind and merciful towards human beings, even those who are foolish, though they become our sworn enemies, reviling and persecuting us? We should regard them as Bodhisattva manifestations, who in their great compassion are employing skillful means to help emancipate us from the painful karma we have produced over countless kalpas through our biased, self-centered views. If we awaken in ourselves this deep, pure faith, offering humble words and taking sincere refuge in our true nature, then with every thought there will bloom a lotus flower, each with a Buddha. These Buddhas will establish Pure Lands everywhere and reveal the radiance of the Tathagata beneath our very feet. May we extend this mind throughout the universe so that we and all sentient beings may equally bring to fruition the seeds of wisdom. So this part about being kind and merciful even to people who would be nasty to us, terrible to us, condemning of us, even putting us to death, even possibly. Let me mention something that Harada Roshi realized. Harada Shodo Roshi was born into a family. His father was a priest, and he and his mom ran a Buddhist temple. And back then, because it was after the Meiji Restoration where things were really changed, and a lot of Buddhist temples lost their support. Many of them simply became family temples or were owned by the local Sangha, meaning the local lay Sangha, local supporters, and they really functioned as funeral directors. They're largely known in Japan today as funeral directors. Basically, when you get married in a Shinto service. When you die, you get buried in a Buddhist service. And so there is a subset of Buddhist monks, priests really, who train in authorized, accredited, essentially, Buddhist temples to do that work. And so it's a 2 or 3 year training period in which they learn how to give a decent Dharma talk, how they learn to do chanting, how they learn to do at least some superficial zazen, and generally be kind of a parish priest. Not super trained, but trained to do a certain kind of job in the Buddhist religion. To become a Roshi, to become a Zen teacher, takes considerably longer training, and that is ongoing, minimal, intensive training for at least 20 years in the Rinzai sect. And even then, you may not be ready to teach, but that's aside. So Harada Roshi grew up in that environment where Buddhist priests who were at that level were somewhat disdained, actually. And in fact, there's a Japanese movie that's a big joke about this. This guy dies of a heart attack, and then his family gathers for the funeral, and this priest comes in this enormous big car and drones on as people are sitting seiza without any cushions, just on their knees on the tatami, and you can see people wiggling, and so on and so forth. And so he had no interest whatsoever in becoming a Buddhist priest. In those days, and in these days as well, particularly the male children of family priests are ordained around the age of 5 or so. So it was with him. And with the idea that someday they would inherit the temple and do the same thing as their father was doing. And there's an interesting case some time ago in Japan where there were no sons, and so a daughter ended up inheriting the temple. I never knew how that turned out, but it seemed to be a forward-looking event. But who knows, since I don't know anything more than the fact that she became a priest and was taking over her father's temple. So Harada wanted to become, first he wanted to become an astronaut. He wanted to ride in a rocket, and then he wanted to be a pilot. And then eventually, when it got to be time to go to college, he wanted to become a psychologist because he really didn't like himself. He saw that he had attributes that he really didn't like and wanted to change. And he thought that going into psychology would give him an avenue to do that. But when he was in college, his father asked him to go to school early. He was living in Nara. He was born and raised in Nara. And it's a short train ride between Nara and Kyoto, where he was going to college. And so he went earlier, and actually I think he was on a bus. And I don't know if he took the bus from the train station or if he took the bus from Nara. Either is possible because they have a wonderful transportation system in Japan. At any rate, he was on a bus. It was rush hour and quite crowded. And as he was going along, there was a stop, and an older man dressed in priest robes got on the bus. And young Harada noticed him because he seemed unusually clear, profoundly quiet, deeply calm, unlike any priest he'd ever met. And he was delighted to recognize that the man got off at the same stop that he got off. And not only that, as it turns out, this was Mitra-roshi, and he was the head priest at Ryuin, which was a sub-temple of Myoshinji. And it was exactly to that temple that young Harada was supposed to deliver these papers from his father, because his father was a Rinzai priest. He was so profoundly impressed by the man's demeanor. Mitra-roshi simply, quietly made his way through the crowd and sat at the back of the bus and began reading a little book. No fuss, no irritation at the crowd in the bus trying to make his way through. He simply was profoundly accepting of the moment as it appeared to be. And it was such a profound experience for young Harada that after he graduated, he walked from Nara overland to Shofukuji in Kobe, Japan, and became a student of Yamada Mitra-roshi. After some, I think a couple of years of going to every single sesshin, and the sesshin were frequent, every month, as I understand it, he was kind of disgusted that he still hadn't had a kensho yet. He came out of a Rohatsu sesshin just totally depressed that he hadn't seen into his true nature yet. And so he went to Mitra-roshi and said, I'm going into the forest and I'm not coming back out again until I've had a kensho. And Mitra-roshi didn't say anything. He just simply nodded, and off young Harada went. By this name, he had a Buddhist name, which was Shodo. And so he went and he camped for a year in the mountains, and there are plentiful mountains in Japan. They're everywhere. It's all mountainous. And one day, as he stood up, it was, I don't know what time of day it was, but it seems like it was late morning, and encountered a group of young people coming up in the mountain to do their own quiet zazen up in the mountains. And they looked at him, saw how he was dressed in robes, and asked if he was a Buddhist monk, and he said yes. And then they said, "You are so lucky to be able to do this practice full time. We all work, and we have one day off a week," which is typical, by the way, of Japanese work weeks. And we use that one day a week to come up here and to do zazen. How wonderful it is that you are able to do this full time. And something in that triggered a very deep awakening in Harada Roshi. And he says that what it made him realize, and this is very important with regard to the felt sense that I have mentioned many times over, and I'll say a little bit more of that in a minute. He realized that all he had to do was simply to receive whatever came to him, simply to receive it. That means without ideas about it, without getting irritated, without, and I think I'm putting myself in a corner here too. By the time he realized that, he probably didn't get irritated at things, at least not to the degree that he did before. But simply to receive, meaning receive the energy of it in our body, no matter what it appears like, whether it's frightening, whether it's challenging, whether it's embarrassing, whether it's daunting, whether it is whatever it is. Simply to receive it, to feel the energy of whatever reaction we have. That is the experience of the felt sense. That's all he had to do. And he has lived by that since then. After 20 years in the monastery, he became the 5th Dharma successor of Yamada Mitra-roshi, and was sent to Enji, which was a terribly run down, but originally very prominent temple in Okayama, Japan, to bring it back to life, and that's exactly what he has done. When I was there were probably about 12 of us in residence, and vast distances between the mats in the zendo, and every single sanzen, every single one of us got in to see the teacher. It was quite remarkable and incredibly valuable. An intense practice. Sesshin after sesshin after sesshin after sesshin after sesshin. And not only was there what were termed ozeshin, which were the big sesshin, which are like our regular sesshin here, but they had even more hours of zazen. And on top of that, required yaza of at least an hour after the end of the evening sitting. Sittings began at 4 a.m. in the Hondo with chanting, an hour of chanting. And then we went to the zendo, did a couple more chants, including Hakuin Zenji's chant in praise of zazen in English and in Japanese. And then sat down to do zazen, and immediately sanzen started. And it didn't end until we all went up to breakfast. And then there was a very short period of work, and we were back in the zendo until lunch, and then an extremely brief period of rest after lunch, and then teisho, and more zazen, mandated group exercise. After all, it was in Japan, where everybody does everything together. And then it went on until the end of Sanzen at night, which would sometimes go until 10 o'clock at night. And then on top of that, then your extra hour of the yasa. So you didn't get a lot of sleep. Not only that, but there were 3 or 4 days in between that ozashin, every ozashin, and what was called kozashin, where the schedule was almost the same, except there was more work during the day. So you got a big dose of intensive practice, and it was quite wondrous because you had no choice but to go deep. But I'm straying again from the subject matter. The point in bringing up Torei Enji's vow of the Bodhisattva was to comment on the situation at Shofuguji that I've mentioned before, in which Harada was leading a work group, a small work party, outside the main gate, or the inner gate, I should say, of Shofuguji, and they were still on the Shofuguji property. And that there was a group of homeless people living on the property who felt somehow the temple was cheating them out of water. And so the leader of the group, with his followers behind him, approached Harada as the monk leading the work party. And there were some lay people, including a couple of friends of mine, actually, in the work party. That's how I know about this incident. And this guy was, as described by one of my friends, not a stranger to violence. And he was standing in very close to Harada, red in the face, furious, berating him about this, whatever the problem was with the water. And Harada Roshi, even though he wasn't Roshi then, but because he had had that experience of recognizing that simply receiving whatever came to him was all he had to do. He simply received the man, honored him because he was able to simply receive him and not have ideas about it, not be frightened of him, even though the man certainly was threatening violence based on what I was told. In fact, the person who told me this story said that he had a shovel because of whatever work they were doing, and he hung onto the shovel in case he needed to whack the guy if he took a punch at Harada, which turns out he didn't do. But what Harada did was become totally present, inwardly deepening, honoring the man, not arguing back, clearly not feeling like he had to not argue back, but becoming increasingly silent. And what happened was that mind state began to be mirrored by that furious man. And he too began to become less and less enraged and increasingly silent. And in the end, because of the honor and the presence, the total presence, and the utter seamless receipt of this man that Harada demonstrated, it was settled harmoniously. The friend that told me this didn't know how it was settled. I don't know if he didn't know Japanese at the time or not, but it was settled, and the man and his followers went away. This is remarkable because at the end of this chant, it talks about, if we awaken in ourselves this deep, pure faith, offering humble words and taking sincere refuge in our true nature, then with every thought there will bloom a lotus flower, each with a Buddha. these Buddhas will establish pure lands everywhere and reveal the radiance of the Tathagata beneath our very feet. That is a metaphor for what happened that day between Harada Roshi and the furious homeless man. Harada Roshi is not the only person that this could happen to. Years ago, at this point, it's way more than 20 years ago, and the man that was a grad student at the time, Eugene Gendlin, has since died in his 80s. But there was a study done to determine whether or not there was something they could pinpoint in the way that either therapy was done or people received therapy that made some people unable to transform even with 10, 15, 20 years of therapy. And others within the first 3 therapy sessions were changing and changed in positive ways. And they very quickly discovered that what the 3-session transformation people were doing was tuning in to what he termed the felt sense. That is the sense of energy in our bodies. And that was what made the barriers disappear so that they could gain insight and move forward in their therapy and become little by little free of their issues. That's an important aspect of Zen practice. It's not therapy. But when we do Zen practice, we sit down on the cushion, we extend the out breath, and the more we let go our sort of cover up yada yada, the more we open to the experience of where we're caught. We become aware that we have an underlying nervousness or fear that we manage to avoid feeling through all kinds of means. Hyperactivity, there's lots of ways to do that. But that when we employ that felt sense to work with these senses of whatever they are, whether it's fear, whether it's anxiety, whether it's embarrassment, whether it's shame, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be anger, frustration. When we tune into the felt sense, that is how that energy feels in our body. Suddenly, like Longchenpa says, or said, because he lived in the 10th century, the feeling is freed in its own place without having to be gotten rid of, and is transformed into pristine awareness that has no negative tinges to it. Suddenly, we can become free. And if you have used this practice, which takes time to sort of get so you can work with it, because we have spent however long in our life trying to avoid feeling what we don't want to feel. And so we have to sort of undo that conditioning little by little by persistent attempts to tune into our body. And if you tune into your body to the degree that you sort of know, for example, that you're angry, but it's sort of a two-dimensional sense, you're still not tuning into the felt sense. If you tune in to the point where it feels three-dimensional, you suddenly are not in your head about it. You're not in the stories about it. You're in the felt sense. And staying with that felt sense until it dissolves. Not till it goes away, but till it dissolves. And there's a palpable feeling of dissolution. Like, then it's a major victory in terms of becoming free of our stuff. And it's essential in practice because we can sort of bull our way through practice into some level of teisho, and elbow aside any ideas or recognition of dysfunctional behavior that we've engaged in. And this is how we could have people who ascend, if that's the right word, I'm not sure it is, to becoming Zen teachers, even Zen masters, supposedly, although they're not masters if they haven't mastered this part because it's major, and still can abuse their students or abuse their temples in one way or another. We've seen this, unfortunately, in Buddhist teachers in America, and not just in America, and not just limited to Zen. And so it's important to do this work with a felt sense, so that when we are able to meet challenging experiences in such a way that there blooms a lotus flower, each with a Buddha, and these Buddhas establish Pure Lands right beneath our feet. That's that metaphor of recognizing that, like the experience of Harada Roshi and the homeless man, it's a very different experience. Everyone can do this, but there's definitely a learning curve, and it requires a fair amount of zazen as well, because zazen is what will help us open to the places where we're caught, and then we employ the felt sense to release those caught places. This is vital. It's an absolutely vital aspect of Zen practice for anyone who wants to do true Zen practice. I think that's enough for today. And wow, goodness, because it's almost time to quit. I thank you for listening, and we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.